Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is James Finesse, Events Manager for Cambridge International. Welcome to our live Q&A session with Dr. Rhonda Bondie as part of our Cambridge Schools Conference Online, Education in a Changing World, Remote Teaching and Learning. In the course of the next hour, we will be discussing some of the themes raised in Rhonda's keynote video, What Makes an Excellent Online Teacher. Before we get started, however, I'd just like to briefly cover some short housekeeping. During today's session, it will not be possible to have either your cameras or microphone switched on. However, you will be able to submit your questions using the Q&A function in the toolbar. Today's session is a unique opportunity to put your questions to Rhonda. However, we only have 1 hour with Rhonda today, so we please ask that you keep your questions focused to Rhonda's video. In the spirit of keeping things focused, it is possible to like fellow participants' questions. So we ask that if you see a fellow participant has asked a similar question, similar to something you also would like to ask, please like that question. This will give us a greater opportunity to answer as many questions as possible. I'm now going to hand over to Lee Davis, Interim Director for Teaching and Learning here at Cambridge International.
Thank you, James, and a very warm Cambridge welcome to you all, wherever you're joining us today, whether that's live on the session today or watching a recording later on. A very warm welcome to you all. Now, before I hand over to my colleagues, Anna Smith and Julie Reid, who will be leading this session with you today, I just want to say a few words of introduction. Firstly, you do not need me to tell you that the world has changed irrevocably over the past year, after the past 12 to 14 months. The way we shop, the way we socialise, the way that we break bread together has changed irrevocably and has undergone tremendous transformation. And we're now at a stage, of course, where we're wondering, well, what sticks, what stays, what will not go back to the old ways? And for us in education, of course, that means we're asking important questions about the way teachers teach and about the way students learn, with specific emphasis, of course, on the learning environment that we provide for students in which all this takes place. We're talking about a transition from the physical space and an emotional one to a virtual digital one. So how can we start to address some of the key questions about what stays with us as we transition again from digital learning back to classroom learning, or what sort of hybrid model are we going to be looking at? And it's questions like this, of course, that are essentially at the theme of this conference that we're running with you over the next 2 weeks. And we're delighted that we have Dr. Rhonda Bondie with us today to pick up some of the key ideas that she presented in her talk. Now, before I finish, I would like to express a deep sense of gratitude to Dr. Bondie for the way in which she delivered her address. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that the patience and kindness shown in helping us tackle some of these key issues is deeply appreciated. It was the respect being paid to fellow professionals who did the very same job as her that really came across in the talk. And as I say, I'm immensely grateful for that. So it's on that note and in that spirit that I would like to hand over to my colleagues to get this session underway. Thank you, everyone. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Lee, for that. And it really is a huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Rhonda Bondie from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Rhonda brings expertise in teacher professional development, online learning and inclusive education, as well as over 20 years as an educator in urban state-funded public schools. I've really enjoyed discussing the themes of this conference with Rhonda and watching her keynote. She has such a passion for teaching and for learning, and such an interest in supporting teachers. And I know she's going to answer our questions today with knowledge and with passion. Before we get going, I'd like to echo what Lee says, and that is a huge thank you and a huge sense of admiration for every teacher that has been in the classroom, virtual or real or mixed, across this time. Every school, every member of support staff. This has been an unprecedented year and a half, and everyone deserves so much praise. So I know there are going to be lots of questions to Rhonda today, so I want to get started straight away. And I'm going to begin with some questions that have been pre-submitted. And thank you to all of you that sent questions in. And then later in the session, we're going to get on to questions that are being posted in the chat. Please do put your questions in the chat. Please do like the ones you particularly want to see answered, because we will be looking at that. And if we don't mention your name particularly, we will often summarise questions rather than reading out particular ones if lots of people are asking the same things. So Rhonda, I'd like to get started with the question that's come through the most. And that's about student engagement, and especially something very practical. And that's the issue of cameras on or cameras off. And we know there might be all sorts of good reasons for cameras being off, but we also know that then we can't see what the learners are doing. And so what's your advice for maintaining and monitoring their engagement in that environment?
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with all of you today. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm glad for that question because it's come up very frequently here in the United States as well. And my advice to you from working with many teachers is that to really think about why we want the cameras on. It's usually behavioral engagement we're trying to monitor. So we believe that if the camera's on, students that shows behavioral engagement. However, that doesn't really show affective or cognitive engagement. So I question sometimes the extent to which we need the camera on. So my advice to you would be to think about how students can demonstrate their engagement in other ways that show cognitive engagement. For example, doing polls, doing a shared document where students are contributing, stopping and having students annotate an image, and then looking at the annotations and coming back. I think that thinking about engagement in different ways, because oftentimes when we're looking at students, they can be nodding their head and smiling, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're understanding. A quick low stakes quiz where you say, where you test what we were just talking about is probably a much better way to find out if students understood what you just said. So I think if you're really looking to build relationships, then perhaps individual conferencing with students, phone calling, meeting with them where they're more likely to turn their camera on in a smaller group is a better idea, because in the larger group, it's unlikely you'll really build those kind of relationships with the camera on anyway. So I think I would not pick that up as a conflict, but think about what kind of engagement do I want to see, and what are the tools that I have to ensure that kind of engagement. And I think when we take our attention off the camera and focus on the engagement that we want, we'll be more successful, and the students will engage as well.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to pick up immediately one of the questions that's come up in the chat here, and that's really about how do we choose the right tools for virtual engagement? What kind of methods would you use to kind of choose those tools?
Oh, it's a great question. I think first of all, thinking about what are the tools that you use in person and naming those. You know, I need a whiteboard to do what? To display my directions. I need a filing cabinet. I need notebooks, ways for students to store and collect their work so they can manage, look at their work over time, notice their growth. So you think about instructionally the kinds of things that you need and how those look in person. And you'll probably for sure want a technology tool that can substitute or replace those things that are essential to teaching and learning in your context. So that would be sort of the floor or the baseline, is I would make sure that the main tools that I use, if students use manipulatives, okay, what kind of manipulatives are there online, so that I have a substitute for all of the things that I use just regularly in the classroom. And then I would take a moment to think about, well, what are the affordances of online? The affordances of online are differences in time, for example. Online, time can be sped up, it can be you can go back in time and start something over, pretend it never happened again. You can do things asynchronously, so you can have a conversation when you're not all together. So I would think about the differences in how I could use time. Time is such a precious resource and we have so little of it. So how could I use technology tools to increase the amount of time and increase the amount of learning opportunities by the way the tools can adjust time? So another way we can reimagine teaching and learning through technology is location. Right? We don't all have to be at the same location. And through technology, students could pursue their interests to different locations. So I might think about how would different locations increase the learning opportunities for this particular unit. And I might go unit by unit and think about what are the things that have really limited me in the past. Oh, I wish students would have had an opportunity to this in this unit. Students really would benefit from an outside speaker in this unit. Students would benefit from a field trip in this unit. And I think you could find technology resources to really enrich and bring in new ways the kinds of learning that you had hoped, are always hoping to achieve in an in-person classroom. So it can really extend and reimagine. But first, I would start with a simple substitute, making sure that I had the things that I've normally relied on so that I feel that confidence. And then I would, in each unit, try one thing reimagined, one thing that wouldn't be possible in an in-person classroom that's now possible through an online environment. And that's how I would choose the tools. I would make sure that across the school, there are very few tools being used. A few good ones. Students and their parents have way too many logins. So we don't need lots of different things. We need a few things that can work in that substitute way and that can also provide opportunities for us to reimagine teaching and learning.
Thanks, and I love that focus on let's try and find out what it is that the technology does that we can't do if we're in a face-to-face classroom environment, and I think that's something that's really, really powerful. I'm going to pick up one more question with you before passing on to Julie, and this is something that's starting to come up in the chat already and also came up in a lot of our pre-submitted questions, and that's around what you said around student variance and the fact that you might have a really wide variance of experiences in that class. Some students who have really fallen behind, some students who have gone much further ahead. And we've had lots of questions around, well, how do you deal with that? How do you plan to support a class when there is such a variance? And how do you do it without increasing teacher workload to a really high level? So something on that would be great.
Oh, of course. There's, of course, many, many things that you can do. So I'm going to highlight two things that are very practical. So the first thing is for each task, I create what I like to call must-haves and amazing quality criteria. So it's not the amount, it's not the number 5, 4, 3, but it's how the quality that I would expect in student responses. And the must-haves, everyone must have, and the last must-have is one amazing or awesome or beyond or whatever the word is that would be most inspiring to students in your context. And what this does is it makes visible to all students the kinds of quality one is expecting in the work. If you're expecting certain vocabulary, if you're expecting certain sentence structure, you're expecting evidence from the text, you're expecting multiple strategies, you're expecting, what is it that we're expecting would make a high quality response. This helps in a number of ways. One, the teacher is not circulating for students saying that one after another. And two, students who may be struggling to get into the task, it becomes very clear for them the things that they are doing and the things that they need to do, so they can ask better questions and seek more specific help. Instead of, I don't understand anything, they can say, I'm at this point and I want to improve the quality of my work by doing this. So it makes it very clear. So the must-haves will increase both clarity and access for all students in the classroom. This is particularly important when some students are going to need additional help. It frees you up to provide that help to the students, because many of the students can just manage on their own by annotating in their work. So those quality criteria are not for the teacher, they're for the students, and the students must annotate in their own work where they see those qualities. Then when you're coming around as the teacher, you can begin a conversation because you see what the student thinks is the quality, whether it's correct or not. You'll be able to clarify that very quickly as you're going around. So the students are annotating the work. And this works beautifully online because students can highlight, they can circle, the teacher can add comments. So the must-haves and amazing criteria are a wonderful tool, and it doesn't add any work. Everyone's doing the same task. So then those amazings are, how can students go beyond this task? What would make this task, not extra work, 5 extra sheets, 2 extra problems, but this task? You in maths, for example, could you change the units, or could you change the strategy? Could you explain your thinking? Could you go back 2 weeks ago and show how this problem is different than something we've done before? Could you make a connection to what's happening in the world or another country, right? So we're going to focus on thinking, and all of the higher level thinking questions that we wish that we had time to ask, we're going to put in the amazings or awesome column. Not to say that you don't put any thinking or must-haves as well, but you're going to put the beyond, the things that if you had more time, you would ask students to do. And then all we're simply going to do is require all students to complete the must-haves and at least one amazing. But those amazings will provide optimal challenge for students who finish early. They can keep going back, but they're working still within the same task. They can share some of the things that they've done with the class, and we can see additional strategies or what this might look like in another country. So I think like the must-haves and amazings are something that really requires no extra work. You can create those collaboratively with the students during the lesson. It's just basically every time we go to give an assignment, we make sure that the quality, not just the quantity is in your directions. You must have 5 paragraphs, complete 10. That's the number, the amount is in the directions, but the qualities are in your must-haves and amazings. You can take qualities from all of your standardized rubrics that are required for writing assignments and other things that you would use. Just pull out some of those quality criteria and put those into your must-haves on a regular basis. Then when students are given the very large rubrics for standardized type assessments, they're very familiar. It's like seeing an old friend. I annotate my work for this quality all of the time. So that is a great way to begin to differentiate instruction and really design tasks for the wide range of strengths that students are bringing and past experiences to each and every task without adding any extra copies, any extra grouping, any extra anything. Just must-haves and amazing quality criteria. So that is my first strategy, and I invite you to start that, this afternoon if you're teaching. And my second suggestion is to always identify the help resources for each and every task. So we're going to identify the quality, And then we're going to identify the help resources. And I often put this in 3 columns. So it's must-have criteria, amazing criteria, and then the help resources that you could use to complete this task. You're not required to use them, but these are the help resources that are available. And the help resources can be just anything that you normally have in your classroom, whether it's dictionaries or notes or a textbook or a video of yourself or another student solving the problem. Whatever the help resources, it's amazing. If you do an audit, you'll find that there's loads of help resources that are available for every task without making anything new. The teacher can identify those, but it's nice to identify the help resources with the students and ask them, wow, let's look at this task. What are the help resources we could use? We don't have to use them, but let's identify them. And we're going to start practicing with students to identify help resources and begin to use them on their own without the teacher necessarily saying, use this graphic organizer, use this dictionary, but teaching students how to have the disposition to look at a task and then to determine the help resources and the autonomy to go ahead and find that help resource. So my first approach that will give you a very strong start at reaching a wide range of students would be to identify the must-have quality criteria, the amazing or beyond quality criteria, and the help resources for each and every task. You can do that ahead of teaching, but you can also do it collaboratively with the students. And I think that would give you a very strong start. After, say, 3 months of that, you may begin to say, oh, this student needs some individualized work. I'm going to give a mini lesson with an individual or a small group of students and a different assignment. But I wouldn't start there. I would start with must-haves and amazing criteria and the help resources. Why? I know that I can provide that every day in every lesson. Students, it's a guaranteed opportunity for learning. When I'm planning something different and special, I might not be able to do that every day. So that will be down the road. So first, I would say I usually give myself a good 3 months, get that as a good routine with the students. All of my students understand how to use that resource, and then I would move on to things that may take additional time.
Thanks. And just before I pass on to Julie, I got some feedback there. James, is that happening on the main screen as well? Hopefully not. Just before I pass on to Julie, we've had some specific questions in the chat as well about what we might in some places call special educational needs, in some places call learning difficulties or learning needs. And do you have any advice on how particularly you would support students with those needs in an online context?
In an online context, I'll tell you, the must-haves, amazing, and help resources work fantastically if that's just a routine in your classroom, because when students have an accommodation on that they are required to serve them with their disability, those can be incorporated pretty easily into the must-haves, amazings, and help resources. So I think that's very helpful. One thing I like to do with my students with disabilities is have them tracking their own progress toward their goals. Many of the students have individual goals, and so I set up a routine with them where we are regularly meeting, and they are collecting their own work that shows progress toward their goal. I think oftentimes teachers feel like they have to manage the individual learning of the student, and that takes away some of their independence. So we want to support them in that for sure. And I might identify a few assignments this week that would be particularly useful to collect into their portfolio. So for example, I might use a slideshow or a folder or something like that online, and students can take a picture of their work or save their work into this folder so that we can see progress over time toward the goal. I find this to be very useful in meetings with families And the student can present themselves their progress toward these goals, even young children. I'll often have 3- and 4-year-olds choosing pictures that show them working toward a goal, and they put those pictures into a slideshow, and maybe they record an audio of what they were doing in the activity, why they liked it, and how they think it helped them learn and work toward the goal. I think the younger, even in a 4- and a 5-year-old, the more the student is aware of the goal that they have, the better it is in an inclusive classroom, so that they can see how the things that we're doing in the class are helping them move toward achieving their goal. So I think the first thing I would do is try to focus on how can I make the student more independent in achieving the goals that are outlined in the learning plan for the child.
Thanks, Rhonda. That's great. We're going to move on to a slightly different direction now for a bit, and I'm going to hand over to Julie, who's been monitoring the chat and has got some questions to share.
Hi. Yes, we've had a question there, basically saying that many of the principles that you talk about are good face-to-face principles as well, and in classroom teaching. So is there anything else that teachers need to think about or be aware of when they're in an online environment?
That's great. I think in an online environment, the one thing that we want to think about is the things that we can do online that we couldn't do easily in an in-person environment, and try to do one of those things each month. You know, just one thing. Adjusting time, adjusting location, adjusting materials, adjusting topics. There's things that we can do online that are very difficult, that would require a lot of photocopying, that would require just way too much effort to gather the materials. Things like even changing the reading level of a text can be done very simply online. So I think like those are the things in terms of planning, but in terms of student learning, the students are the same. We're humans. So I also think just because we're online, not to forget that we're teaching humans and all of the things that human beings need. They need to stand up. They need to feel the motivation. I always teach teachers the 4 elements of motivation are autonomy, or being able to be independent, belonging, feeling like you belong, competence, knowing what you know and knowing what you need to know, and how to get help to do that. Like you feel like you can do something and you know how to get help to do the thing that you need to do next. That's competence, knowing what you know, knowing how to get help to pursue the thing that you're trying to learn. And meaning, seeing your past self, your current self, your future self, catering to students' interests, making sure that students have some value, whether it's just a change from what I did on Monday to Wednesday, or the utility of what we're learning. So I call it the ABCM. It's easy to remember then. ABCM: autonomy, belonging, competence, and meaning. And so regardless if we're online or in person, we're teaching human beings who are motivated, who the feelings of motivation are autonomy, belonging, competence, and meaning. So those are going to go across both places. And what's fun is just thinking about online as just another environment. It's like, what would you do differently if you were teaching outdoors, right? And that would be an outdoor environment. And what would the opportunities be and the affordances be? Okay, great. Okay, now I'm teaching online. What are the opportunities and the affordances? So I think like a lot of it is just the way we frame our thinking about the environment, and would allow us to think of all kinds of ways that we can enjoy online as well as in person and many other environments.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. Also as well, just thinking as well, we've had a few questions around sort of from a practical point of view. So in the first wave, when teachers transitioned and students transitioned to online learning, and continued to cover the syllabus, but then when those students returned into the classroom and back to in-person teaching, that there was a sense that they wanted to go back over the content that was actually covered during online teaching. So whether you've got any advice that you could give to teachers with dealing with that situation, that would be great.
I think one habit that we can start is to begin each lesson with not starting the lesson, but starting by finding out, not starting giving students information or the topic, but starting by finding out what students are bringing to the topic. So I call this identifying the starting position. So what we want to do at the top of every lesson is make sure that students see the goal. If you think about like a sporting event, how clear the goals are. There's like a big yellow goal thing or a net or something where you can literally, everyone in the space sees the goal. And in addition to seeing that goal, students have to see their starting position, where they are in relation to the goal, and the teacher needs to see that. So we want to open up with the first activity being something that establishes those two things. So it could be, one of my favorites is I say 2 by 2 by 2, and I clap my hands, and the students have to move into 2 groups. I just did this last night at Harvard with my graduate students. I moved them into Zoom rooms, and 2 people, and they had 2 minutes. And they had to come up with 2 questions on the topic that I was about to teach. 2 by 2 by 2. 2 people, 2 minutes, 2 questions. And then we gathered those questions. You can gather them in the chat in class, you can gather them on the board, you can gather them in lots of different ways. Last night I went from groups of 2, and then they got in groups of 6, and then they had to up questions in the chat till I ended up with the questions that the class found most interesting on the topic I was going to teach. That whole process took me about, I don't know, 6, maybe 8 minutes. But in that 8 minutes, I understood the vocabulary that students had, the content knowledge they were bringing, the ways this topic was interesting to them. And on my feet, I could adjust the next bits of the lesson, all of the different activities, based on what I saw in those beginning questions. And that served a lot of functions. Number one, students who hadn't thought about the topic at all had their peers talking about the topic. So they started to re-engage their previous knowledge and their previous vocabulary, right? So it started to activate all of the knowledge that students were bringing to the topic by giving them a couple of different groups and a couple of different ways to think about the questions that they had. Then I'm able to learn from that, and the students can see their starting position in relation to the goal, and it's a much better place to begin a lesson from, a much stronger place to begin a lesson from. I think if you commit yourself to always finding out what students already know about a topic before you begin to teach it, whether it's something simple like 2 by 2 by 2, which of course you could change. You could make it 4 if you wanted groups of 4, and you could give them 5 minutes, and then you could have them have 2 facts. You know, it could be any kind of number of people, amount of time, and kind of product that would help students reveal what they already know about the topic and launch the conversation. I think the starting position is key, because then teachers are likely not to review things that students already know, because you've taken time to find out what they know in the beginning. You can also do, if the discussion is complicated, you can do low stakes quizzes using like fun online group quiz tools, or in class, it could be a group game, but something that would really be fun and low stakes at the beginning of the lesson. But I think starting with something like that will will help you to feel like you don't have to just cover things, but you want to teach precisely the things that students need to learn. So how can we do that? It's usually by finding the starting position before beginning. I always teach my teachers at Harvard to listen before you teach. So make sure that you are finding a way to listen before you teach. I will say some of the challenges can be that you feel like you don't have enough time in the lesson. So I would invite you to think about doing that listening bit perhaps the day before, so that you can look at the student responses and then show them the responses and launch the next day if you need to create more time. But you definitely want to listen before you teach and make sure the students themselves know the starting position in relation to the goal. It's very important, or otherwise they won't have autonomy during the lesson, and you as the teacher will be carrying the whole class. You want to make sure that the starting position isn't that you're not the only person who's aware of everyone's starting position. The students themselves need to be aware of that. So that's my advice for that.
Okay, thank you ever so much for that, Rhonda. I'm just going to hand over now to Anna, who's got the next few questions.
Yeah, so Rhonda, thank you for that. We've had quite a lot of questions coming up in the chat around how can we make sure that students who are working at home and in an online environment, that it's actually their work, and how do we put things in place to ensure they really are learning and it's not maybe someone else helping out or them just kind of checking the answers with each other in a way that we don't want, because of course we know that obviously sometimes checking the answers is exactly what we want. But what are your views on that?
We had office hours last night here with the Harvard students talking about that very thing, and the pluses of students doing things collaboratively, and like a quiz, for example, and then all submitting the same answer, and how what's happening there. So I think, like, okay, the key is to assign something that couldn't be done in that way, right? Where someone is having to explain their thinking, where students are perhaps recording a reflection on their work and describing it. So a lot of it is, in part, the assignments that we give. If we give a task that makes it easy for that type of thing to happen, and it doesn't really require a personal connection, like how is this work different than the work you did 2 weeks ago? How has your thinking changed? What are your next steps? How will you use this in your life? Things that are personal to the student. So I think making sure that our assignments require the student to do some metacognitive reflecting on their own thinking about the assignment will help to mitigate that a bit. The other thing too is, I think, really informing parents. I really increased communication with families, and I think in a really great way. I think we want to equip families with questions so that they become great question askers of students, and encourage families to understand that the correct answer is really not the goal. It's the thinking that got to the correct answer, and the thinking beyond the correct answer that actually matters. So if your child isn't thinking about their learning, learning is a consequence of thinking, which is one of Harvard preeminent researchers, David Perkins, always says, learning is a consequence of thinking. So we want parents to be equipped to help their children think, which is going to be primarily through asking questions. So I would encourage families to ask questions and then set up the tasks so that the correct answer is just available, and so that it's not a thing where, like, giving someone the correct answer. The thing is, can you explain the correct answer, or can you explain why these answers are incorrect? So try to put the emphasis, not like correct is great, but that's not the goal. The goal is beyond correct, understanding how you got to the correct answer, what you might do next time, which of these 5 problems could you use that strategy on? You know, you really want to be pushing to the thinking. And I think once we are pushing to the thinking, it makes it difficult to just copy somebody else's work, because you can't really explain or copy someone else's thinking. So I think that would help. And I think the other thing too is teaching students that they want to be autonomous themselves, and so that they can advocate for themselves, that no, I'm going to do this on my own, and teaching students the affordances of testing yourself to really know what you know and you don't know, so that you can ask questions to find out the things that you want to learn. So I think also equipping students with the understanding that the goal is not the correct answer will help students say, actually, I'd like to do this on my own, to family members who may be offering to help a little too much.
And I think you were, when we spoke the other day, you were talking about some mathematics examples that you'd seen, is that right? Where they'd deliberately taken out all the working and the students had to prove how they got there?
Yeah, yes, you can have, sometimes we have students where we don't allow them to complete the problem, and they just have to explain the help resources that would be useful for each of the problems. You can also, sometimes we give students problems already solved that are incorrect, and they have to explain the mistake and what the person was thinking, what math they brought to the problem, and then how that mistake might have happened and what kind of thinking should happen the next time. These kinds of moves, explaining, here's the problem, now change the unit to 3 different types and do the problem again. You know, just thinking about things that would be fun, opportunities for students to use and think with what they know. And I think the more interested students are in the work is so that it's learning as opposed to work. When students are finishing work for me, they don't really care if they did it or somebody else did it. The goal is getting it done, and they just want to get it done. But when students are invested in their learning, for example, they're really trying to collect evidence of work that leads to a goal that they can explain, they will be much more likely to engage in the learning, to complete the learning, and to do it themselves. So I think maybe if you're having a lot of problems with students not completing their own work, you might think about, you know, do students really understand the goal and the benefit? Think back to motivation, autonomy, belonging, competence, and meaning. Usually one of those feelings is missing, and I need to increase those feelings to get the outcome and learning that I'm looking for. So that might be really helpful.
Thank you, that's great. Right now, we've had a question been posed in the chat, which I know Lee Davis has also answered, but I know that one of your specialisms is online assessment, virtual assessment, and so we've had a question here. Really, do we all need to change the way we assess to be more online and to use more digital tools? What's not wanting to put you in the spot about us, but just more broadly, what is your feeling here?
Mm-hmm. I think the online formative assessment tools are the most amazing thing ever, right? Where students can do polls, quizzes, annotate things. And I think, you know, I do all those things in the classroom, and then I do a show and share where they have to, you know, show me their paper where, and I can do a quick look. But I think some of my colleagues in the New York City public schools and I were brainstorming, like, how can we keep the amount of formative assessment? Literally, we have formative assessment going on every slide during an online lesson, where the students are having to engage with that slide and do something, even maybe get something from their home environment and bring it to engage. They're maybe having to stand up, sit down. There's just a lot of engagement in the formative assessment. So I think, you know, trying to find ways to increase the formative assessment in the in-person classroom, now that we've gotten so used to it online, will be an important thing to keep going forward. And I would say that if you're finding you really want to increase engagement online, increase the formative assessment, increase the opportunities for students to let you know what they know, what they're thinking, in making that visible. So I think that would be really important. In terms of big online assessments, the one thing that I really like about online assessments is that students you can say, I'd like you to do this project with no parameters. They can bring all different kinds of materials. Some students could make a video, some students could make a puzzle, some students could write a paper. If the goal isn't writing, remember that if you're offering a variety of project ideas, for example, then there can't be a single outcome like write a 5-paragraph essay. If the goal is write a 5-paragraph essay, then everybody engages in writing a 5-paragraph essay. But if the goal is to tell us about some kind of learning or to create a portfolio of your learning where you're doing reflections, I think the online environment affords much greater opportunity. For example, I required all of my students in my own classes to keep a teaching journal of the decisions they made so that we could analyze the kinds of decisions they made to adjust instruction when they noticed all students weren't learning. And I told them there were no parameters on this journal. Some people kept a beautiful drawing journal, others typed, some wrote sentences. Last night, when they shared their journals, some had created screencasts, making animations to show how their thinking had changed over the semester. I think sharing the projects was more fun than, was probably the greatest fun we had in the class. And we used a common rubric for that. People were looking for thinking. They were looking for specific content objectives. They were looking so the rubric was exactly the same, but the projects and the materials were limitless because it was anything that was free online. So I think, you know, when you're thinking about projects, even when we are moving forward with more in-person instruction, maintaining projects that can use these wealth of online resources would really create greater opportunities for all students.
Thanks so much for that. There's loads to take away from that. Julie, I think you have a question you'd like to share.
Hi, yes. We've had a really interesting question in the chat here around blended learning. Basically, that, you know, online learning is here to stay in some capacity, and how best can we integrate the online environment alongside an in-person school environment?
Mm-hmm. I think you're definitely right. The online environment, I hope, is here to stay. I could imagine, you know, normal center time in schools where students were engaged in an online module that had been created instead of a teacher making, you know, lots of papers. I think that affords one teacher making a module that could be available across many classrooms. So for example, if we have students who need extra practice in retrieving skills that haven't been used frequently this year, teachers could make some modules to help with that retrieval practice or previewing content so that they're better prepared. We know that what students already know is the best predictor of what they'll be able to comprehend from a reading. So perhaps we want to preview and make sure students are coming to reading a text with background knowledge they need. I could see videos and other things that would help students build that background knowledge so that they're better prepared to tackle that grade level text. So I think it would be great. I think like the affordances with keeping the online modules is that they can easily be shared across classrooms and across schools. So if I've often worked in the central office of school districts here in the United States, and one of the problems is like one school might have a resource or a teacher with particular skills. Only the children in that particular school building have access to that teacher and their specialized expertise. But through an online means, that teacher could teach a lesson and serve students in many different buildings. So I think, and this is another way to really increase services for your students with disabilities, where instead of a teacher traveling to all those different schools, they could actually increase the amount of instruction time by staying in one place and meeting at least periodically with all of the children from 5 schools, you know, at one time online. So I think, again, thinking about the things that have really been problematic in terms of using a lot of resources, and the main resources are time and materials and people in the schools, and thinking about, okay, now that this has become ubiquitous and now that it's become a habit and we've developed all this expertise, how can we leverage that expertise to tackle some of these problems of students not having enough time with one teacher, or a teacher with particular expertise only in one location and wanting to spread out that expertise. So I think like those would be really important things. Another thing that I think we should absolutely keep is bringing people into the classroom. I think one of the greatest things that happened in the last year is that guest speakers, professionals, people from around the world, students from around the world. Like I was visiting a class in Germany a few weeks ago, you know, that you can visit and communicate. We live in a global world. Students are going to school to prepare for the rest of their life. Bringing in the world to the classroom is a wonderful thing that we can do very easily online. So I hope that that is just a standard now part where we're bringing people in and inviting communication with people outside of our local community.
Thanks, Rhonda. And I can't believe we're almost at the end of the hour already. It's gone so fast. I've got one final, very quick question for you. You said in your talk that we shouldn't be thinking about going back. We should be thinking about going forward. And we should be keeping the things that have worked as we return to the classroom. Mm-hmm. So if you had to give us in 30 seconds, one thing, the top thing that you would keep, what would it be?
Can I have 2 things? I would keep communication and creativity. I think that this last year has really drawn the light, the focus on the need for greater communication between the teacher and the students, and our relationships with our students and their families and the larger community. And things really broke down because we didn't have total communication, many ways for us to communicate with families, and ongoing expectation of communication. So I think communication has really increased this year, and I hope that we keep that going forward. And I think the other thing is creativity. I have seen the most creative lessons from teachers and their students in the last year. And so I just invite you to keep thinking of new ideas and out of the box to solve the challenges that we all experience as we're guiding the learning of students with many different needs and strengths. So I'm so happy to have had this opportunity to talk with you, and I look forward to going forward with you as well.
Rhonda, thank you so much. And it's a real testament to all the ideas that you started raising with us, that there are still loads of questions in the chat that we haven't been able to get to, and many apologies to those people whose questions were not answered. We were really trying to get through as many as we can, but so much for us to think about there. Everything from what makes great online assessment to how do we differentiate, how do we plan for inclusion. It's been an absolute privilege to hear what you have to say, Rhonda, and to work with you. We're going to be able to pick up some of these themes next week. For those of you who are joining us in the panels, there'll be the chance to think about this with people in your kind of wider subject areas. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what people have to say. Rhonda, we have a couple of minutes left, so I just wonder if you had a last word that you would like to share, something that's particularly important and powerful that you'd like us all to take away.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like you to take away a feeling of confidence. You know what to do. You inside yourself. So if you take away this idea of motivation, motivating yourself and your students, the ABCM, I think would be like the secrets that you could keep to help you problem solve as you're going forward. Like, you have the tools, especially when all the cameras are off, and the things that actually it makes us feel hurt. And but focus instead on ABCM and say to yourself, are my students feeling autonomy or independence? Are they feeling belonging? Do they feel competent? Do they know what they know and what they need to know, and feel like they can get help to get what they need? Do they feel meaning? Is this relevant and important and valuable? And I think the ABCMs help us think about our teaching and learning in such a powerful way. So I invite you, I drew that from decades of motivation researchers. It's not my idea, but the ABCM has really supported me in my teaching, and I offer that to you.
Well, we've come to the end of the hour, and it's, as I said, been such a joy to discuss teaching and learning with you, Rhonda. I hope that we can keep this conversation going, and I hope that one day we'll be able to all sit in the same room and have this conversation face to face. But it's been absolutely wonderful to talk about how the digital world is helping us now and how it can help us in the future too, as we move forward. I did just want to mention that we will be sharing the recordings of this Q&A, so if you missed bits, don't worry, it's all there, you can listen again. But thank you very much to everyone, and a particular thank you to Rhonda for the time that you spent with us.